Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 12, which is called Innovation and Exploration 1453 to 1533. And in some ways, it's a continuation of the last chapter, which began discussing the Italian Renaissance. This chapter continues the discussion of the Italian Renaissance, moves on to talk about the Northern Renaissance, and then begins the discussion of the Age of Exploration. So, those are the three main topics we're going to look at tonight. So the chapter begins with a discussion of the printing press, which was a really important invention around the 1450s, invented by Johannes Gutenberg. And it played a major role in spreading the Renaissance. So remember, we talked last time about Renaissance humanism, which was an intellectual movement that looked back to the sources of ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration. And one of the main impacts the printing press had was it allowed these Renaissance humanist scholars to take their new editions of classical Greek and Roman texts and mass produce them so that people could be reading the same book all over Europe for the first time in human history. Previous to this, every book was handwritten, and as a result, there was no way to really compare one copy of a book to another. If you were reading a copy of Cicero's letters in Italy, in Rome, and someone else was reading a copy in England, it's not like you could say, turn to page 25, because in a handwritten book, every page 25 would be different. But with a printed book made using a printing press, every copy of the book would be identical. And so scholars would be able to look and compare their texts. They could have footnotes that told people what page they were on. They could be reading the same book all across Europe, and it created a shared intellectual space for people to study these texts. And so that really helped Renaissance humanism, Italian humanism, and it also plays a role in what we call the Northern Renaissance, which we'll look at later on today. Another big impact of the printing press is that it standardized written languages. So, all over Europe, people spoke varieties of dialects of English and French and German and Italian and Spanish, and there wasn't one fixed version of those languages. But as printing became more common, the most popular books sort of defined the nature of the written language in each of those different countries. And so we get things like the King's English, which the textbook pointed out was the variety of English spoken around the city of London, which became the standard form of English because it was the one that was adopted by the printed books. All right. The Italian Renaissance, though, is also uh, a result of the political features that were in place in Italy. And so, one of the things that really differentiates Italy from France and England, which we focused on primarily this semester, is that Italy was divided. France and England had united countries. They were creating those strong centralized national monarchies we've been talking about. But Italy was a divided nation. There were dozens of different city states and territories in Italy, each of them largely independent and often at war with each other. And also, Italy found itself the battleground of Europe. As France and Spain began to expand their control of Europe, the wars they fought were often fought in Italy, often with Italian soldiers. And so Italy was a place of great warfare. It was a great place of great division. And interestingly enough, that led to a flourishing of intellectual and political and artistic life. One of the main figures of the Italian Renaissance that we're going to talk about today, and we'll talk about him a little more at the end of this lecture, is Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Florentine official during the short-lived Republic of Florence, and when the de' Medici family, the former rulers of Florence, returned to Florence, he was imprisoned. And he wrote a series of books on all kinds of different topics, but two of the most famous were on politics and history. One of them was called The Discourses, and that one argued that Italy and other people should embrace Roman style republicanism and they should have a popular government where the people ruled themselves. But he also wrote a more famous book called The Prince, where he basically laid out a manual for despots and kings to rule over people. And this has led to, 500 years of speculation as to which one of these is the real Machiavelli. The important thing, though, is that Machiavelli's The Prince became a famous work, which we still read to this day, and we're going to talk about some more when we talk about the documents for today. And The Prince basically argued that morality must be separated from politics. And so this is kind of the first person to argue that you don't necessarily need to be a good person to be a good ruler. And that idea has motivated political theory and political science ever since. Finally, when you think of the Renaissance, you mostly think of art. And so this is the period when we get figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and others. The most important things to keep in mind when looking at Renaissance art is that the Renaissance was a period when realism became especially important in art. And this is true in a couple different ways. So, one of them is that artists began to use perspective, which was an artistic technique that made things appear three-dimensional, even though they were flat two-dimensional pictures, but they gave the appearance of three-dimensionality. And also painters and other artists and sculptors began studying anatomy, many of them engaging in illegal vivisections of corpses, dissections of corpses, so that they could learn the way that bones and muscles and other things connected to each other. All of this was designed to create more realistic portrayals. And as we talked about last week, the influence of classical models played a big role in Italian Renaissance art. It was about a return to ancient Greek and especially Roman standards of art and sculpture that really inspired these Italian Renaissance artists. All right. Now, the Renaissance didn't remain limited to Italy. In the later 1500s, it began spreading northward into Northern Europe, France, and Germany and England. This is called the Northern Renaissance. And the biggest difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance is that while the Italian Renaissance was focused on classical Greek and Roman texts, the Northern Renaissance used the same critical techniques and the new kind of reading and the humanist approaches to literature, but applied them to the Bible and applied them to the writings of the early church fathers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome. The most famous of these northern humanists was Erasmus, Erasmus. And Erasmus was a monk who was freed from his ecclesiastical responsibilities. So he was a monk, he became a priest, but he never actually worked as a priest in a parish. He went to the University of Paris and then he became kind of a traveling writer and philosopher. He was famous for a number of things, but one of the most important is that he created critical editions, just like the Renaissance humanists in Italy did of classical texts, but he made them of the Bible, in particular the New Testament in Greek, and also the writings of Augustine and Jerome and Ambrose, the Latin church fathers. He also wrote a number of satires attacking corruption in society and corruption in the church. And he was a figure who was really influential among the reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin, and the reformers later in the 1500s. But interestingly, even though he inspired the reformers and many of them looked up to him, he never joined the Reformation. He remained a Catholic to the end of his life, as did most of the Northern Renaissance humanists. Um, they inspired the Reformation, but they remained separate from it. The big topic today is the Age of Exploration, which is the period when Europe begins to sail first around the coast of Africa and then into India and China on the one hand, and then with Christopher Columbus westward across the Atlantic Ocean into the New World of North and South America. The age of exploration really begins in the 1400s with Portugal. There's a Portuguese leader named Prince Henry the Navigator who founded colleges of navigation and cartography in Portugal. He encouraged the development of new kinds of ships. He also encouraged the colonization of the Canary Islands in between Europe and Africa. and he really pioneered the Atlantic slave trade. He was one of the leaders who really began the Atlantic slave trade, picking up African slaves and then using them for agricultural labor and also as servants in Portugal. The Portuguese basically began the age of exploration by sailing south along the African coast, and their initial goal was acquiring gold. And so they built a series of fortifications and trading posts all along the western coast of Africa, which they used for the gold trade. Later, as the slave trade expanded, they used those same forts to monopolize the slave trade. But they had a larger goal, which was eventually reaching India. And so, over the course of the 1400s, they began sailing further and further south along the coast of Africa until in 1488 they sailed around the southern tip of Africa. And then in 1497 they reached India. And once they reached India, they began trading in spices. And spices were a commodity that was very expensive, very light and easy to carry, and also very important in European trade. Up until this point, the Ottoman Turks and the Venetians had dominated the spice trade, bringing the spices overland from India into the Ottoman Empire and then sailing them in the Mediterranean Sea over to Venice. The Portuguese wanted to sort of cut out the middleman and sail directly to India, pick up those spices, and then sail back to Portugal, where they would sell them all across Europe. And the Portuguese monopolized the spice trade within about 15 years of reaching India. And the reason they were able to do that was because the Portuguese ships were a bit larger than the ships in Asia, and they also were outfitted with cannons. Europeans didn't invent gunpowder, they didn't invent cannons, but many of the technologies that were used in Europe to cast large bells for churches translated really well into the production of high quality cannons. And because the European ships were big enough to hold artillery, to hold cannons, they were able to easily destroy Indian and Chinese and Ottoman fleets in the Indian Oceans, and eventually they dominated the spice trade for many, many years. Now, the Spanish were inspired by the Portuguese to do their own exploration, and they were led by the most famous explorer of all, Christopher Columbus. I was always told when I was in school that Christopher Columbus was the only person who knew the Earth was round when everyone else thought the Earth was flat, and that's actually not true. Everyone in Europe, for the most part, knew the Earth was round. Christopher Columbus, though, thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. And because he thought the Earth was so much smaller than it really was, he thought it would be easy to sail westward from Spain and arrive in Japan and China. He tried it in 1492 and ended up in Cuba, not India, as he had originally assumed, but he did return to Spain with small amounts of gold and native people. And as people began to realize that they discovered an entirely new world, Spain and Portugal set out to claim that new world for themselves. They claimed it before they discovered it, and so they settled on a dividing line, which actually cut South America basically in half. And Portugal got control of Brazil, but Spain got control of more or less all of North America and the rest of South America. Now, they didn't get much gold, but they did bring some large amounts of silver over from the New World to Spain. But probably the most important thing they did was they created large empires, especially Spain, by conquering places like Mexico and Peru. They created large empires that they then populated eventually with large numbers of African slaves. And they created slave based plantation economies that shipped vast amounts of food and resources and silver and other things back over to the New World, or the Old World, I should say. The term that historians use to describe the movement of people, food, items, diseases between the old world and the new world is called the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus. And the Columbian Exchange is really important. So, first off, disease. The settlers and the conquerors from the old world, from Europe, brought all kinds of diseases, especially smallpox, with them to the New World. And these disease regimes really annihilated large numbers of Native Americans. So we estimate that between 50% and maybe as many as 90% of the native populations of North and South America were killed by diseases that were brought by the colonizers from Spain and Portugal. In addition, vast numbers of African slaves were brought from Africa over to the Caribbean and to North and South America during the Age of Exploration and the years afterwards. Now, a number of plants and animals also moved back and forth between the Old World and the New World. Some animals and plants went from the New World to the Old World, and so things like potatoes and tomatoes and corn and chocolate and tobacco all made their way to Europe and Africa and Asia from the Americas. And then from Europe, Africa, and Asia, the Americas acquired horses, sugar, and coffee. And these movements of people and diseases and objects really played a huge role in shaping the cultures on both sides of the Atlantic. So, for example, you think of Native Americans in the American West, and one of the most iconic things about Native Americans in the American West is horsemanship. The Apaches mounted on horses, for example. And those horses were not native to North America, right? They didn't arrive in North America until Columbus made his way and the Spanish explorers and conquistadors made their way to North America. Similarly, you think about Italian cuisine or European or even Asian cuisine, the use of tomatoes and peppers and other types of food. None of those existed in Europe, Africa, or Asia before 1492. All of them were imports from the New World. So the Columbian Exchange plays a vital role in shaping both Europe, Africa, Asia, North, and South America. All right, real briefly, I want to look at one of the documents in the Perspectives book, and that is an excerpt from Machiavelli's The Prince on page 430. I actually want to start on page 431 with the section labeled On the Reasons Why Men Are Praised or Blamed, Especially Princes. And Machiavelli says something really interesting. At the bottom of the first column of page 431, he says, a great many men have imagined states and princedoms such as nobody ever saw or knew in the real world. For there's such a difference between the way we really live and the way we ought to live, that the man who neglects the real to study the ideal will learn how to accomplish his ruin, not his salvation. In other words, people in the past have written about the way the world ought to be, but Machiavelli was going to write about the way the world really was. And what he says is that princes are blamed and praised for certain qualities. He says some princes are generous and some are stingy, some are givers, other grabbers, some cruel, others merciful. One man is treacherous, another faithful, one is feeble and effeminate, another fierce and spirited, one humane, another proud, one lustful, another chaste, one straightforward, another sly, and onward. He says, I know everyone will agree that among these many qualities, a prince certainly ought to have all those that are considered good. But, says Machiavelli, that's not really possible. And therefore, a prince must be shrewd enough to avoid the public disgrace of those vices that would lose him his state. So it's not that he should avoid the vices, Machiavelli says, but he should avoid the public disgrace of those vices. But only the ones that would lose him his state. If there's a vice that wouldn't lose him his state, Machiavelli says it's no big deal if he has that vice, right? And at the very bottom of 431, he says, for if you look at matters carefully, you will see that something resembling virtue, if you follow it, may be your ruin, while something else resembling vice may lead, if you follow it, to your security and well-being. In other words, sometimes being the bad guy is a good thing in politics. The rest of this discussion talks about some examples of this. So on page 432, he talks about liberality, so generousness, and stinginess. Is it better to be loved or feared? Is it better to be cruel or clement? Should a prince be honest or should he be deceitful? And the answers he comes up with are often that doing the wrong thing is the thing that is most effective for being a powerful and good ruler. Not good in the moral sense, but good in the sense of holding on to power, which for Machiavelli and the Prince is really the main goal. All right. So if you have any questions about anything we talked about, make sure you bring it up on the discussion board and I'll do my best to respond. Otherwise, we'll see you next week for chapter 13 when we begin talking about the Protestant Reformation.